Shalom, you all. I'm glad you joined me tonight. This lesson has taken many years to put together. Uh, Welcome. This is a NETIV program, and the title of my lesson tonight is going to be Genesis and Geology, exploring the age of the universe and human origins. Recently, I've been in three books that let me put it this way. I have studied a great deal on this whole subject of origins and the universe. Um, some of the books that I'm using, for example, tonight I'm using the work of Rabbi David Brown, which is called The Mysteries of Creation. I'm using Yetzirah, or yes, Sefer Yetzirah. I'm also using another book that's called by Ari Kaplan, which is called The Age of the Universe. I mean, it covers other things, but The Age of the Universe is one. And another book that I had picked up and was reading was called The God Code by Greg Braden. Now, I'm not going to teach all three of those books, but I want to give you an understanding that I've been struggling with this whole thing for a long time. And tonight I decided, or a few weeks ago, I decided I was going to make it what do I want to call it? I'm going to identify creation of man as opposed to all of the men beings that have been put on this earth. Now, I want to use the term carefully. The question of man's beginning and the age of the universe both find, what do I want to say, critics and multiple points of view. The Torah seems to teach that the universe is only 6,000 years old. That would mean an instantaneous beginning, while geological information and archaeological discoveries, all of that show that the Earth is much older than that. In fact, the understanding is about 15 billion years old. So my purpose tonight in doing this lesson is going to be dealing with the understandings of when creation began and the Jewish understanding of the creation of man. Now, there's going to be some questions, things that I want to keep in mind. What are the primary sources for both religious and scientific opinions? And I've got several, as I was saying, several books. And there's no binding opinion that won't involve some sort of a fundamental understanding in using faith. We also need to keep in mind that there is a strong feeling in the Christian communities for the idea of creationism, a 7-day period from the beginning of creation to completion. All this fitting into our perfectly 6,000-year timeline. But we should also realize that there are opinions that are far different than that, even in the Orthodox community and in the B'nai Noach group, because they hold no stock, Christianity doesn't, in the oral Torah. And that's something that we need to understand. The oral Torah is a version of a commentary. It's not based on one book, but multiple kinds of books, a library full. Now, nowhere in the Talmud will we find a final verdict on the age of the universe or the beginning of man. We're just going to begin by trying to understand what the scriptures say and what the oral understanding is and how it fits with geography and how it fits with archaeology. So we need to understand that there's room for both a caveman and an Adam. We also need to understand, because the age of the earth and the universe is, it's important not to hold too strongly to a life of being only found on our planet. Even giants like Saadia ben Yosef, better known as Saadia Gaon, who lived in Egypt several hundred years ago, supported the idea of extraterrestrials. Now, I'm not going to talk about the extraterrestrials tonight. That's a subject which I began to deal with, but it's obviously not complete. So I want to begin by saying, not too long ago, there was a concept that I found called the Sefer Temu'ah. Now, it's a very ancient Kabbalistic text, and it was written by a rabbi named Nahanyu Hakanah. And he held that the earth was destined to last for 6,000 years, and by the end of the 7,000th year, it would be destroyed. Well, I needed to add to this, that the rabbi, although he was speaking of 6,000 years and 7,000 year periods, it was not based on our yearly cycle, but it was actually based on Jubilee cycles, which are 50 or 49, 50-year cycles. So 6,000 years was times 49 years in his understanding. And he came to the conclusion that the earth was some 42,000 years old when Adam was created. Well, that would mean there were other worlds before Adam's, if we go that route. And from a scientific point of view, the age of the earth and the universe is far greater than 42,000 years. Astronomers, archaeologists, climatologists, geologists hold the notion that the earth is approximately 15 billion years old. So how does this fit with the text of the Torah? How can we find a hint of 15 billion years? Well, there is a Talmudic passage, which seems to support the idea of a sabbatical theory. And that's the key, sabbatical theory. Now, according to the Talmud, there were 974 generations before Adam. And this comes from the Talmud in Hagigah 13b. Now, to support this idea, we need to go for maybe scriptural quotes like Psalms 105:8. Remember forever his covenant, a word he commanded for 1,000 generations. Key, 1,000 generations. So that would mean that the Torah was not destined to be given, well, until 26 generations after Adam. Now that would make it accessible finally to Moses' generation at Mount Sinai. In fact, there's another article called Merakit, Elokit, which is called the Order of God, explicitly states that these generations existed in the sabbatical cycles before Adam's creation. Now, I'm going to come back to that later as we move forward and begin to talk about the formation of Adam. But I wanted to give you that background because it's important to understand. So in the book of forms or likenesses that we began with, we have to understand that the earth is not, well, the earth is not a sabbatical cycle, but a jubilee cycle. And but a more recent source, if you can call someone who was born in the 13th century recent, Rabbi Isaac ben Samuel from Akka, he was better known as Isaac of Akka, was a Kabbalist in Spain. Now, he arrived in Spain from Italy, where he had met with Rabbi Moses de Leon, which was a extreme enlightened Kabbalist. And he learned from him the secrets of the composition of the Zohar, which is another book that I've used for this writing. His writings include a commentary on the secrets of Rabbi Moses ben Nachman. Another character that I've used his name is normally referred to as Nachmanides or Ramban. And there's a commentary which I talk about, which is Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Creation. Now, it's hard to think of a 1350 as recent history. And I need to mention that most of the more recent Kabbalists, such as Moses Cordero, which is called Ramak, and Rabbi Itzhak Lurie, which is, he's the Ari, have refuted the earlier understandings, and they hold to the standards that Rabbi Aki has come up with. Now, his book is called Orz Ha'im, which is called a treasure of life, or a treasury of life. He expanded on the understanding by placing it in God time. Well, midrashic sources in the Psalms identify a day for God as 1,000 years. You've heard that expression, I'm sure. And a divine year then would be, 3,600 365,250 years. That would be the extent of a year in divine time. And then he took that 42,000 years and he multiplied it times 365, and he ended up coming up with the number 15,000 or 15 million 340 wait 15,340,500,000 years old. So science basic the age of the universe on its expanded estimate matches up pretty close with Rabbi Akko. It's hard to imagine that a rabbi 600 years earlier estimating the Earth's age so closely to scientific thought. I mean, imagine he is doing this 600 years ago. Now, it's important to know that this opinion exists today in a great deal of classical Jewish literature, not just in a couple of books, but lots of books. And it's taught in various classrooms or denominations of Judaism. Now, the book speaks of this staggering amount of time is all covered in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. Remind yourself. Now, the earth was tohu vabohu, astonishingly empty, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So English says we're talking about emptiness and we're talking about darkness, astonishing emptiness. The word tohu actually means chaos. So the earth was chaos. And bohu establishes the idea of an undisclosed time period. So it's just an expansive time. So we have chaos for an expanse of time. And it points to the word void as addressing some 14 billion years. But there's one more fascinating and perplexing problem regarding time and creation. Remind yourself that the Bible begins with two accounts of creation of man. The first account is in Genesis chapter 1, begins in chapter 1, and goes to chapter 2, verse 3. That's the 7 days of creation. But there's also a second one that begins in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, and goes to the verse 13. So why is there two creation stories of Adam? Well, I want to look, there's going to be several discrepancies in the two accounts, but let me go through this one. And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. So God created man in his image, in the image of God. He created him, male and female. He created them. So in other words, the first story tells us he created both males and females. Now, from this, we get the idea that Adam and Eve were created simultaneously. But the second version, you remember verse 7, tells us that Hava was a part of his rib. Do you remember that? It goes on to say, well, let me read it. And the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground, and he breathed into his nostrils the soul of life, and man became a living soul. So Talmud now is telling us that God created the first couple in his mind, and later in Genesis 2, we read about the story of actually man's creation. But that doesn't help us because, we've got all of these archaeological and geological events that show us that there were men on this earth before that. Let's go through the one significant problem that's easiest. In chapter 1, verse 12, and I don't know how much Hebrew you know, but the word that's used for Adam or man here is Adam, A-D-A-M. Now, he wanted to make man, Adam, which means in his image. Now, if we look at 127, we see the story speaks of this specific Adam. The writers call him Et HaAdam. Et HaAdam. So that's the Adam. Now, the Hebrew word comes from the word Adamah. Adamah speaks of the earth or of ground. So 127, well, are we talking about the ground? Are we speaking of forming the same created being in both verses? Doesn't appear as though that's true. Now, before we go there, I want to have us think about climatology, geology, archaeology, and other systems of dating, because the Earth has experienced cold periods, informally we call them ice ages or glacials, and warm periods, which are called in science interglacials. Now, roughly every 100,000 years, we cycle through this ice age. So the last ice age actually occurred, well, some say as much as 1 million years ago, but most people say it's less than that. The last of this ice age glacial peaked around, well, actually 20,000 years ago. So 1 million doesn't work. And of course, these cycles are global average temperatures, warmed and cooled anywhere from 3 degrees to perhaps as much as 8 degrees Celsius, which is really 5 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. It was partly through their attempts to understand what caused and ended the previous ice ages that climate scientists came to the understanding the dominant role of carbon dioxide plays in the Earth's climate changes. And that's why we constantly hear the people talking about the climate change that's going on. Now, according to science, the oldest human is known as Homo 1 remains. He's better known as the Leaky Man. They found him in Omo Kabish Formation, which is in the southwestern corner of Ethiopia. And it lies within what's called the East African Rift Valley. And recent research says that this creature, this character, was created or was buried about 320,000 years ago. Other possible older human remains have also been found, and the oldest appears to be anatomically, well, like a modern man. It was found in Morocco and are believed to be some 360,000 years ago. But those findings are still being disputed. Now, for the sake of this study, we want to call the Leaky Man the oldest recognized Homo sapiens. Well, maybe I don't. Please understand the fact that that's even in dispute. We do have fossil remains of being called the Australopithecus, which is identified as a female skeleton they call Lucy. She's supposed to be 3.2 million years old. Now, we also have Homo habilis, or better known as the handyman, and he was dated back to 2 million years ago. And then there's Homo erectus, or the upright man, and he was 1.5 billion years ago, and he's found in Europe. And another one is called the Neanderthal, or the pre-Neanderthal man, which is somewhere between 400 and 300,000 years ago. And finally, we have the Cro-Magnon man, or what we know as the modern man. But he is the first example of a true Homo sapien, is what science calls him. Now, all of these fossils lead us to the idea that, well, there's an evolution in man. But there's a problem. Why are there millions of years has the form of the brain or the skull and the brain capacity remain exactly the same? If everything is evolving, then we should begin to see changes all the way along the line. Now, this is especially true of a skeletal remains discovered 160,000 years ago. Obviously, our understanding of evolution, well, we came by that honestly from Charles Darwin after he took the trip to the Galapagos Islands in 1836. But did you know that after returning, he didn't publish his article? He didn't publish until 1856, 20 years later. Why? Because his ideas were a part of a joint paper that was presented at the Linnean Society of London. He spoke on this subject in support of another scientist, Alfred Wallace. Wallace made his theory known earlier, but he lacked scientific support. So when Darwin came along to add evidence in support of his idea, well, after that, it was published. Eventually, it became known as the origin of the species. Archaeological evidence suggests that people first started farming 11,000 to 9,000 years ago, and they built their first cities around that same time. Well, that would have made it 5,500 years earlier than the city that Cain built for his son Enoch. Among the oldest cities prior to Cain's city would have been a city in Turkey or an ancient Sumerian city and Jericho. In Jericho, part of the archaeological evidence points to the fact that there's a tower there, which dates back 9,000 years ago. But what man-made structures can we point to that indicate that early civilization, earlier than the Cains? Well, we've got cities. Well, there's other things that we can find. I taught a while ago about the Giza Plateau and the Giza pyramids. There's 3 of them. And also on that same plateau is also the Sphinx, being all of them supposedly about 4,500 years ago. But science is now looking at it again, and they're coming up with an entirely different idea. Did you know there are over 5,000 dots on our planet that are actually pyramids? Egypt, Sudan, Cambodia, Indonesia, France, Italy, Germany, Holland, England, Scotland, Ireland, Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, Libya, Lebanon, Peru, Bolivia, Japan, Poland, South Korea, China, South Africa, United States, Nigeria, French Polynesia, Tenerife, Malia, Mauritania, Pakistan. They all have pyramids. How can we have pyramids all over the globe? And some of them, again, date further back than 5,000 years ago. Now, the theories of the use and purpose of these monuments or pyramids speaks of the idea of temples, offering or observatories, places of sacrifice. Some researchers, when they were looking at it, claimed that the Pyramid of Giza, well, they're much more than what we think. We know that the 3 pyramids that are on that mountain all point their one corner directly north, not towards magnetic north, but direct north. Researchers point out that the erosion patterns from around the Sphinx. I don't know how many of you have read up about the Sphinx. Did you know the Sphinx was buried all the way up to its head? As erosion happened, it washed away all of that sand that was there. So we now are down to the basin of where the Sphinx actually, we can see the feet and all of the other parts. Researchers have had a difficult time dating this whole thing because radiocarbon, which they use in dating, cannot be applied to stone, only to fragments of organic matter found in the vicinity of that. But there are no organic matter found there. We also had another problem, and that is with the Sphinx. You see, overall, archaeologists and geologists now are dating the Sphinx between 10,000 BC and 4,000 BC. And again, Adam's date of birth was not until 4,000 BC. So this happened before that. So here are a few more. There's plenty of sites. I should stop there. Now, the beginning of farming and the oldest megalithic structures date back 11,000 years. The earliest cities were first built around that time as well. However, there are those who argue that civilization precedes those dates by thousands of years. But those earlier and possibly advanced civilizations were wiped out due to the cataclysmic events. We know that there's constant periods of ice. We've gone through continuous ice ages. We've also gone through flood times. I don't know how many of you read your scripture, but Enoch, well, he had a son named Enosh. This is before the character that we call Enoch. Anyway, he had a son, and it was during his time that a third of the world was flooded. Then we know Noah's flood flooded the whole thing if we follow the Bible. Now, there's a new scientific theory that understands evolution happened, or, well, actually, it helped us understand evolution. 1953, science got a new tool. The tool came in the science of genetics. They were now able, because of James Watson and Francis Crick, they began to understand the double helix, the structure of DNA. Throughout that significant advance, the field of molecular biology was really showcased. Now, the work along with others created what became known as the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine in 1962. You know, we now have the ability to understand whether a corpse that's been buried for a great length of time, the hair color, the body appearance, lots of different things. And we know we use it now in paternity suits, and we use it to identify personal histories and ethnic origins, and even use it in crime, identifying the understanding of what's going on. But it wasn't until 2000 CE now that the same technology was applied to the study of human origins. Now take a minute and think about this. They're going to sample the DNA of a corpse, and the corpse is going to be thousands of years old. There's a problem. DNA deteriorates. In other words, it becomes part of the structure, and therefore you lose the living part. Now, the oldest subject from which DNA was ever drawn came from a Neanderthal infant who was supposedly 30,000 years ago. The bottom line indicated that the Neanderthals were not part of the modern human chain. Throwing out civilizations before that. You see, humans are not evolutionary. The Jews understand that fact very clearly. They understand there was man, and then there was Adam. According to this understanding, Neanderthals and they had 24 pairs of chromosomes, which amounts to 80 or 48. Humans had 23 pairs, 46, and there's a growing body of evidence that modern man is unique in this way. That made a relief for me as I began to go through trying to understand all that was going on. Now, I want to go back for a second, and I want to take a look again at the 6,000 year period. First, I'm sure that you've read one time or another Genesis 1. But did you ever notice the second verse that closely? Tohu vabohu. Astonishing emptiness. Chaos. Chaos. To understand this phrase, I want us to look at another place, and it's used in the Tanakh in the book of Isaiah. He uses this phrase to describe the devastation that God will bring upon the Edomites at the end. The prophet begins by saying, "It will not be extinguished night or day." Its smoke shall rise for all time. It shall lie in ruin through the ages. None shall cross it for eternity. Tohu vabohu. Isaiah 34:10. Isaiah then describes God's actions in terms of tohu vabohu in a kind of a poetic way. Again, Isaiah chapter 34, this time verse 11. He will measure it with the line of tohu, formlessness, chaos, and with the weights of bohu, emptiness. In other words, the extent of destruction will be gauged with tools calibrated by tohu and bobohu. They will become the way of understanding. Jeremiah is going to use the same phrase. Jeremiah describes a point in time when Judah and Benjamin were about to go into captivity. And you remember that was the 70-year period. And he uses a pair in describing societal mayhem and disorder at that point in time. He says in Jeremiah 4:22, "My people are stupid. They don't know me. They are foolish children, and they are not intelligent, and they are wise at doing bad, and they don't know well." Now, in the 23rd verse, it goes on to say, "I look at the land, and it is tohu vabohu. At the skies, and their light is gone." Now, with the description of the nightmarish primordial state, understands chaos and expansive emptiness. Jeremiah 4 associates those two things with the idea of society being divided. Society regarding intellectual and moral bankruptcy. That's going to be there. Now, in the first creation after Tohu Vabohu, do you remember what verse 3 says? And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. Now, light could simply be talking about sunshine, but light could also be talking about intellect and understanding. Genesis Rabbah, which is a midrashic study, chapter 2, verse 2, it does the same idea of, the idea of perplexity. It changes the words of tohu babohu by calling it toha and boha, which means shocked and confused. Rabbi Bahahu, he said this is comparable to a king who bought for himself two male slaves. Now, both of them on one bill of sale, and for the same price. He ordered the one of them to be cared for at a public expense, and he ordered the other to work hard for his food. Now, the second one sat bewildered and astonished, tohu vabohu. And he said, both of us were on the same bill and for the same price. And this one is supported by the public, and I'm to work this hard just so I can eat. This is the idea that the earth was bewildered and astonished at what was going on. Okay, let's go back and let's rethink about the idea of man, Adam, and the man, ha-adam, et-hadam. There's a subtle difference between man and the man. Now, hopefully you understand that Adam in Genesis chapter 1:27 was not the first man. So how can we make this fit biblically and intellectually? And again, for that, let's go back and look at those two verses again. God said, "Let us make man in our image and after our likeness." And God created the man, ha-adam, in his image. And in the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created him. Notice it begins by saying the man, or man, and then it goes to the man. And again, in chapter 2, verse 7, "And the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground, and he breathed into his nostrils the soul of life, and the man became a living soul." So the Talmud holds with the idea that God created the first couple in his mind, and later he created the story of Adam. But we can also look at that first man, male and female, and see those as the characters that were created prior to, during that tohu vabohu, that chaos period. The same thing that the Talmud talks about when it talks about the fact that there was 974 generations before. Now, I came by this whole understanding from the readings or the writings and the videos of Dr. Gerald Schroeder. Dr. Schroeder received his BS and his MS back in the 60s and had his PhD in nuclear physics and earth and planetary sciences, which is okay. I had a degree in public teaching, but that's anyway, his degree came from the MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And he works on the staff for 7 years before he decides to return to Israel. In the meantime, while working at the MIT, he also was a part of the United States Atomic Energy Commission. He's an American Israeli Orthodox Jewish physicist. He ends up going back to Israel, where he becomes a teacher at College of Jewish Studies, Aish HaTorah's Discovery Seminar. And so he becomes a lecturer for them. Again, Haggadah 13b. He created the Torah 974 generations before the world was created. What is he talking about? I think he's talking about those generations. Remember, the story begins, in the very beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Then it becomes tohu vabohu. So between the time that everything was created and now, this time, there have been 974 generations. Now, as you're looking at this and trying to calculate this, some people have said the perspective is only about 1,500 years. Well, that's not let me try it again. How many different ways has the Bible or the interpretation of the Bible determined what a generation is? Some said it was 25 years. Others said it was between 20 and 30 years. Others said it was 40 years. And still others would say it's 130 years. So that means a generation we don't have any understanding of what a generation is. So if we look back between those billions of years, could we be talking about 974 generations? It's just speculation. It's based on my understanding of this rabbinic scriptures and the fact that Adam was the first man, the man, until the giving of the Torah. In Jewish thought, the idea of people predating Adam and Eve isn't that radical. You see, according to the understanding, it's safe to say that the Jewish tradition is comfortable with the idea that people lived here before that. Also keep in mind, these sources are 1,500 years old. They're not coming from somebody who's a modern apologist. They're coming from dated areas. So who were these people who predated Adam and Eve? Well, the people living before Adam and Eve had the same capacities for rational thought in some way, shape, or form because of the things that they were able to do. They created cities, they took care of the ground, all the things that you and I think of. They built modern structures, they built cities, they started farming. Just, there was a lot of things in common between the two. If you want to get to the idea of 974 generations before Adam, there are other sources that I went to. Bereshit Rabbah, the Midrash on Telahim, which goes back to the Psalms 135. Midrash Takuma, Avod Rabbi Noson, Babylonian Talmud, Shabbos 88b. And there's other places. There's a wealth of understanding that goes along here. So we have 974 generations. Now, Adam is the first of 26 generations. What happened on the 26th? That's the generation of Moses. What happened with Moses? That was the giving of the Torah. That's when man accepted the commitment to the Torah. Prior to that, apparently these 974 generations never committed to Torah. But there was also one other thing that seems to have been missing. It's when God blew into the nostrils of Adam to create this human form, and he breathed into him what's called the neshama, the living soul. Jewish thought is that the dawn of modern man and true civilizations began with that very act. Now, we know there's other things that are going on. Genesis chapter 4, verse 17. Cain knew his wife. Who was his wife? Who did he know? Remember when Cain was killed by Lamech? That was in Genesis chapter 4, also verse 14. What was he worried about after killing Abel? That there would be somebody who would come along who would kill him. Well, who could that have been? Could that have been some of these other people? Now, based on all the sources that I've gone to, it seems that traditional Jewish thought has no problem with the idea that, albeit a little bit different, have been around for a lot longer than the time of Adam and Eve. That's something a long time ago. You've stuck with me for 45 minutes. I spent a lot of time in research. I hope you could glean something from this. If not, I have notes that I'm willing to send you. If you want those, just send me a note and I'll put it to you. Next week, I want to talk to you about the copper scroll because we're getting to the point in time which we call the end of days. And the copper scroll is significant in understanding the end of days and what will happen. So that'll be next week's talk. Technically, I'm done. Anybody have any questions? Anybody still awake to ask any questions?